The early years of Charles II's reign were defined by his government's response to an attempted insurrection enacted by the Fifth Monarchists. The Fifth Monarchists were one of many radical religious movements which emerged and flourished during the English Civil War. Prior to the outbreak of conflict in 1641, the Caroline regime had exercised strict control over the printing press and the literature circulating within the kingdom. During the Bishops' Wars, in which the Scottish Covenanting army successfully invaded the north of England, Archbishop William Laud was especially censorious of any materials which were critical of the Church of England and royal policy. However, when in late 1640 the Long Parliament led to the collapse of Charles's regime, the restraint on heterodox ideas had been lifted. More items were published in 1641 than ever before in English history, a record broken by 1642 and next met in the 18th century. This revolution in communications facilitated the rise of religious and political groups which had unorthodox ideas, many of which emphasized mystical piety and nonconformity from the institution of the Church of England, and overthrowing social relations as they stood in those days. Many of these dissenters were members of the New Model Army, and though they clashed with the Presbyterian ecclesiastical establishment of the Interregnum Church of England, the abolition of the Act of Uniformity in the early years of the Civil War meant that independent congregations could form and conduct their own worship. Sectarians could now assemble in public and distribute their ideas freely, leading to the growth of many movements, including the Quakers and Baptists. Religious anarchy reigned, and amidst such chaos emerged the Fifth Monarchists. The Fifth Monarchists were a millenarian group. They believed that the return of Christ was imminent, and that he would establish his kingdom on earth with the saints, a rule which would last for 1,000 years. His reign, they believed, would be the fifth monarch prophesied in the book of Daniel, which follows the Babylonian, Persian, Macedonian, and Roman empires. Initially, they supported Oliver Cromwell, as they believed that the bare-bone Parliament of 1653, assembled from nominees of the independent churches, would accelerate the rule of the saints. Indeed, it had been Thomas Harrison, a parliamentarian, soldier in the New Model Army, and the leader or a leader of the Fifth Monarchists, who had suggested the idea of putting legislative power into the hands of godly men. However, the rise of Cromwell to Lord Protector dashed their hopes, and they engaged in violent protest. Most notably, in 1657, Thomas Venner, a maker of caskets and barrels for wine, led a small revolt in London, which was easily crushed. In 1660, things went from bad to worse for the movement, as the newly crowned Charles II had Harrison hung, drawn, and quartered on the 13th of October for his role in the execution of Charles I. He signed the order. However, according to Samuel Pepys, the former soldier went to his end as cheerful as any man could do in that condition. Venner, released from prison, took leadership of the congregation, which met in a room above a tavern in Swan's Alley near Coleman Street, where the City of London and Islington meet. At the outset of Charles II's reign, there was widespread hope that he would establish religious toleration within England. This was anticipated because of the Declaration of Breda, in which he promised, among other things, to pardon all crimes committed during the Civil War, and that he would secure the rights of non-conforming religious groups to practice their faith if, and only if, he was recognised as the subjects' king. As the process proceeded, it appeared that there could be a new religious settlement, in which both Episcopalians and Presbyterians could be accommodated within a broad national church. This purported arrangement, evidently, excluded dissenting congregations and those who wanted to be independent of the Church of England, and threatened their ability to worship in public. Charles had promised them religious toleration, and many of these groups protested and urged the king and his government to make sure that they could have their opportunity to meet protected. However, their hopes were most definitely dashed by the actions of the Fifth Monarchists. On Sunday the 1st of January 1661, Thomas Venner led an armed uprising to capture the city of London in the name of King Jesus. Although he had only 50 men, some of whom were veterans of the new model army, initial reports suggested that they were 500 strong. This was an attempt to usher in the rule of the saints, to accelerate the return of Christ by reclaiming London from the evil stretch of Charles II. They began their attempt to take control of the city by attempting to get the keys to St. Paul's Cathedral from a local bookseller. When he refused, they broke in and interrogated passers-by, asking who they supported. When one replied boldly, "King Charles," they shot him dead. Musketeers were dispatched to deal with them, but were pushed back. A militia led by the Lord Mayor Major General Sir Richard Browne attacked the Fifth Monarchists, and they were forced to retreat to Kenwood, a large heath near Highgate. On Wednesday the 4th of January, they resumed their attack on Wood Street and Threadneedle Street, pushing the King's Life Guard of foot, comprising of 1,200 men, to fall back. Venner killed 3 men with his halberd in the assault. The Fifth Monarchists then tried to take Comptor prison in an effort to free the prisoners in the hope that they would join the coup, but were pushed back. General George Monk's men pursued the Fifth Monarchists through the streets of London, who made their last stand at the Helmet Tavern on Threadneedle Street. The troops broke through the roof and shot down on the defenders. Venner was captured, and on the 19th of January he and 10 others were hung, drawn, and quartered for treason. Although the Fifth Monarchist Uprising consisted in 50 men attempting to take control of a city with a population approximately of 350,000 people, it seemed to evoke fear in the ruling regime. Dissenting groups like the Fifth Monarchists were seen as a threat to the political and social order because they were enthusiasts, a sect which believed that they were inspired with a divine spirit, and so had a clear sight and confidence in all they believed. Moderate Anglicans had long attacked nonconformist radicals for their emphasis upon mystical experiences, and they warned that their reliance on experiences meant that they were fundamentally schismatic and rebellious, uncontrollable by the normal operations of the church and state. The attempted insurrection of Venner's Fifth Monarchists seemed to confirm these fears, and Charles II's government embarked on a crackdown of enthusiastic religious movements, with over 4,000 Quakers and Baptists arrested. Legislation was implemented over a 5-year period, each act increasingly severe, anachronistically called the Clarendon Code. These consisted in 4 statutes. The Corporation Act of 1661 limited those who could hold public office to Anglicans who had renounced the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643. The 1662 Act of Uniformity made the use of the Book of Common Prayer compulsory in religious services, subscription to the 39 Articles, renunciation of the Solemn League and Covenant, renunciation of any attempt to alter the government of the church or state, and acceptance of the ordination by a bishop as mandatory for holding office in the Church of England. The Conventical Act of 1664 prohibited meetings of 5 people or more for unauthorized worship, designed to prevent dissenting groups like the Fifth Monarchists from meeting and congregating. Finally, the 5 Mile Act of 1665 prevented nonconformist clergy from coming within 5 miles of incorporated towns, their former charges, and stopped them from teaching in schools. This legislation was similar to acts passed in Scotland. In 1661, the Rescissory Act revoked all legislation passed since 1633, removing the gains the Covenanters had made for Presbyterianism. In 1661, episcopacy was restored. In 1662, all office holders in the Kirk were forced to renounce their former oaths of allegiance to the National Covenant of 1638 and the Solemn League and Covenant. These laws had serious implications for religious liberty. Many English vicars refused to obey the Act of Uniformity due to their religious beliefs. This meant that over 1,000 Puritan clergy, a third of which were from London, were expelled from their churches and livelihood, an event often called the Great Ejection. Similarly, in Scotland, many ministers refused to renounce their oaths to the National Covenant. Somewhere between 270 and 400 ejected from their charges. Acceptable worship was once again Anglican, and deviation was not tolerated, as it was perceived to threaten the social order and Charles's reign. Thus, many of these non-conforming sects were driven underground and prosecuted if they were caught meeting. Crucially, many of people in the population supported these moves. There were many who blamed the Puritans and Covenanters for the violence and mayhem of the wars that ravaged England, Scotland, and Ireland. They thought their emphasis upon mystical experiences necessarily caused sectarian tension, because one person's experience could not be communicated to another. Their authority for acting in one way could not be conveyed to another person. And this contrasted to a religion based on rational principles that all people could be brought to understand and accept, and thus establish peace, a view advocated by clerics such as John Tillotson. There was a real fear that such movements would bring with them the religious anarchy, which motivated the anarchy of violence that plagued England, Scotland, and Ireland in the previous years, and they did not want to go back to that. The Fifth Monarchist Uprising was, then, a catalyst for the censorship of religious and political heterodoxy. Whether the failed insurrection had made Charles II afraid that radical groups could rise up and depose him, as they had done to his father via the New Model Army, or that it sufficed as a useful pretext for greater intolerance, his regime reacted to the botched coup by silencing voices that deviated from royalist Anglicanism and his regime, including those of loyal English and Scottish Presbyterians. Dissent was harshly punished. Fines, jail, and executions were used to stamp out rebellious religious groups north and south of the border throughout Charles's reign. The merry monarch, often portrayed as a lovable rogue who freed England from the shackles of Cromwellian despotism and tyranny, implemented political and religious intolerance in response to the Fifth Monarchist insurrection, a climate of censorship and persecution that would not be repealed for nearly 20 years.